The door wouldn't open, and the click of the lock echoed louder than the sirens still sleeping in the distance. Cold light flickered across the windshield, turning my reflection pale and unfamiliar, while my pulse thudded in my ears like a warning I was too late to hear. I remember the smell of clean leather, the weight of my bag digging into my shoulder, and the sudden certainty that stepping out would mean disappearing. If you've ever trusted someone without a second thought, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Stories like this don't announce themselves until it's almost too late. My hands shook as the car idled, night pressing in from every side, and I replayed the small decision that brought me here, wondering how kindness could feel so dangerous. I believed I was doing the right thing, helping the people I loved, following the life I thought was safe. I had no idea then that this moment was the first tier in everything I believed. Let me show you how it all began. I almost walked into my own disappearance on a night that began with nothing more dramatic than a favor. I remember the cold air against my face, the weight of my purse on my shoulder, and the quiet certainty that I was doing something kind. It was late, close to midnight, and the road toward Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport stretched ahead of me like any other drive I had taken 100 times before. Nothing about it felt dangerous. That was the lie I told myself. I was sitting in the back seat, watching streetlights slide past the window, thinking about how relieved my husband would be when I handed him what he had forgotten. The car smelled faintly of clean upholstery. The engine hummed low and steady. Outside, the city thinned into pockets of shadow. And inside, my thoughts drifted between routine worries and the comfort of being useful to someone I loved. When the car slowed near the terminal, something shifted. The lights grew sparse. The air felt heavier, as if the night itself was holding its breath. My chest tightened, not from panic yet, but from a quiet awareness that I couldn't name. I remember gripping the strap of my bag, telling myself I was tired, telling myself this feeling meant nothing. I believed I was walking toward safety, toward a familiar life that waited for me just beyond those doors. I did not know I was already moving away from it, pulled by a truth that was about to strip everything familiar down to its bones. Before that night, I thought I understood who I was. I believed my life was steady, predictable in the best way, built on habits that made me feel safe. I was someone who trusted easily, who found comfort in routine and meaning and showing up for the people I loved. My marriage felt quiet and solid. Daniel and I were not dramatic or loud with our affection. We shared mornings over coffee, evenings on the couch, and an unspoken agreement that we were on the same side of life. From the outside, and even from the inside, it looked like the kind of relationship that didn't hide storms beneath the surface. I grew up learning responsibility early. When my father passed and left parts of his business in my care, I didn't see it as a reward. I saw it as something to protect, something to handle with care and integrity. That mindset shaped how I loved too. Loyalty mattered, stability mattered, trust was the foundation everything else rested on. And then there was Rachel. She was the friend who knew my routines, my worries, my small joys. We shared weekends, long talks, and the kind of closeness that makes you stop questioning intentions altogether. Looking back, there were moments when I felt slightly out of place, when conversations shifted and I didn't know why. At the time, I softened those feelings, telling myself that love meant giving people the benefit of the doubt. I didn't see trust as a risk. I saw it as proof of who I was. That belief is what made the choice I would make next feel harmless, almost automatic, like any other act of care. After Daniel left that night, the house settled into a quiet that felt familiar and safe. I moved through the rooms the way I always did, straightening pillows, rinsing a mug, telling myself the evening was over. It felt good to be useful, to leave things orderly behind him, like a small promise that everything would be waiting when he returned. That was when I noticed it. His wallet was sitting on the edge of his desk, half hidden beneath a folder, like it had been placed there without thought. I remember picking it up and feeling a small jolt of surprise. Daniel never went anywhere without it. My first instinct was to laugh at how forgetful he could be when he was rushed. The second was a knot of concern that tightened in my chest before I could stop it. I stood there longer than I realized, turning the wallet over in my hands. I thought about identification, about travel, about how complicated even a short trip could become without something so basic. I told myself he was probably already in line, already distracted, phone silenced. I told myself this was nothing. But trust has a way of pushing gently against caution. I convinced myself that helping him now would save stress later, that being a good partner sometimes meant acting without being asked. The decision felt practical, almost automatic, shaped by habit and love more than logic. As I slipped the wallet into my bag and reached for my coat, a faint unease brushed past me, easy to ignore, easier to dismiss as fatigue. I didn't know then that this small choice had already shifted my night onto a different path, one that would carry me out into the dark and into a ride that would not feel right at all. The car pulled up quietly, a dark sedan that blended into the curb as if it had always been there. I slid into the back seat and felt the door close with a heavier sound than I expected. The interior was clean, almost too clean, and the air carried a faint, neutral scent that made it hard to tell how long anyone had been inside before me. I adjusted my coat, told myself I was overthinking, and watched the city begin to move past the windows. The driver barely glanced back. I noticed his posture, upright and still, hands steady on the wheel. The silence settled fast, thick enough that I became aware of my own breathing. No radio, no small talk. Just the low hum of tires against asphalt and the rhythm of streetlights flickering by like a slow pulse. As we moved farther from my neighborhood, the streets grew darker, buildings thinned out. The familiar gave way to long stretches of road with little more than shadows on either side. I tried to relax, reminding myself that airports sat on the edges of cities, that this was normal. Still, my shoulders stayed tight, and my eyes kept returning to the reflection in the window, searching for something I couldn't name. When we reached the airport grounds, relief brushed against me, brief and fragile. Then the car slowed and turned away from the bright entrance I expected. The lights grew sparse, flickering instead of glowing. My chest tightened. I reached for the door handle, ready to step out and walk the rest of the way if I had to. It didn't move. I pulled again, harder this time, feeling the cold certainty settle in my stomach. My heart began to race, heat flooding my face, fingers tingling as panic finally broke through restraint. In that moment, trapped in the back seat with the doors locked and the night pressing in, I was sure of one thing. I wasn't being taken somewhere unfamiliar. I was being erased. I was still pulling at the door when the night shattered around us. What had been silent only seconds before exploded into light and sound. Bright flashes cut through the darkness, reflecting off the windows, off the pavement, off my own shaking hands. The sudden noise made my heart jump even harder, but it also froze me in place. Like my body didn't know which fear to choose. I pressed back against the seat, breath shallow, trying to understand what was happening. Shapes moved outside the car, fast and purposeful. Nothing like the slow, suspended dread I had been drowning in moments earlier. The air felt charged now, electric. And the stillness I had been trapped inside was gone. As my eyes adjusted, something didn't make sense. The focus of all that movement wasn't the car, it wasn't the driver, it was several yards away. In the patch of darkness I had been so desperate to step into, the place I thought represented escape, the place I believed was safety. That realization landed slowly, heavily. The fear didn't disappear, it changed. I felt it shift inside my chest, folding in on itself, reshaping into disbelief. The man in the front seat, the one I had quietly decided was my captor, hadn't moved toward me at all. His attention was fixed outward, rigid, alert, like someone bracing for impact rather than causing it. I remember thinking how thin the line is between threat and protection when you don't have the full picture, how easily fear fills in the blanks with the worst possible story. As the chaos settled into something controlled and deliberate, one question rose above the rest. Steady and cold. If I wasn't being trapped, then who had decided I needed protecting in the first place? After the lights dimmed and the movement outside slowed into order, my body finally remembered how to breathe. My hands were still shaking, but the panic had loosened its grip, replaced by a heavy, unfamiliar calm. The driver turned just enough for me to see his face clearly for the first time. Not hard, not threatening, focused, worn, steady. What followed didn't arrive as a dramatic explanation. It came in pieces, settling into me one by one. He wasn't a stranger who had chosen me at random. He was someone who had known my name long before that night, someone my father had trusted years ago, quietly, deliberately, someone who had been asked to watch from a distance, to never interfere unless I was in real danger. That detail alone should have brought relief. Instead, it opened a deeper unease, because protection only exists when there is something to be protected from. As the weight of that truth sank in, my relief curdled into something colder. This wasn't a wrong turn or bad luck or a coincidence wrapped in fear. The danger waiting outside that car hadn't wandered there on its own. It had been placed, planned, timed. I felt that realization move through me slowly, like ice spreading under skin. My life hadn't brushed up against a harm by accident. Someone had made a decision. Someone had believed I would step into that darkness without question. The question wasn't whether I had been targeted anymore. It was who could know me well enough to predict my kindness, who could count on my trust to lead me exactly where they wanted me. As my eyes lifted toward the airport windows glowing in the distance, I felt the answer drawing closer, waiting just out of reach, carried by the people who were supposed to be watching over me, not watching me disappear. As the tension outside eased, my eyes drifted toward the terminal, toward the wide glass where travelers usually waited with impatience or relief written plainly across their faces. I expected to see confusion there, maybe concern, maybe the frantic searching that comes when someone realizes something has gone wrong. Instead, what I saw felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately name. Two figures stood apart from the others, still and composed, familiar in posture before they were familiar in detail. My heart stumbled as recognition crept in, slow and unwilling. Daniel's stance was unmistakable, the way he always leaned slightly forward when watching something unfold. Beside him was Rachel, close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm, her body angled toward him with a comfort that felt practiced. I waited for relief to cross their faces, for alarm, for any sign that they were seeing me and fearing for my safety. It never came. What I saw instead was frustration, sharp and contained, flickering between them like a private language I had never been meant to learn. The realization landed without sound. There was no moment of screaming clarity, just a quiet collapse inside my chest. The people who knew my routines, my instincts, my willingness to help without question, weren't rushing toward me. They were watching, measuring, calculating what had gone wrong. In that instant, memories rewrote themselves, every softened doubt, every moment I had brushed aside because love felt easier than suspicion. I understood then that I wasn't standing at the edge of a mistake. I was standing at the center of a plan. The most painful truth wasn't the danger itself. It was knowing that if things had gone the way they intended, I wouldn't be standing there at all. I wouldn't be explaining. I wouldn't be returning home. And the people who should have been waiting for me were never waiting for me to come back safely. After we left the airport, the shock didn't fade the way I expected it to. It sharpened. Every thought slowed down. Every feeling compressed into something cold and precise. I replayed the night in my head, not to feel it again, but to understand it. That was when the wallet came back into focus. I opened it with hands that were finally steady, the way someone does when they're bracing for bad news they already believe is true. At first, everything looked normal. Cards, cash, the familiar wear of something handled every day. Then I noticed how untouched it all felt. Too neat, too intentional, like it had been prepared rather than forgotten. I kept looking. Tucked deeper inside were things that didn't belong to a rushed mistake. Travel details that weren't for a business trip, plans that didn't include me, paperwork that shifted ownership and control in ways I had never agreed to. My name appeared where my consent never had. Dates lined up too cleanly with what almost happened that night. Each discovery landed quietly. There was no gasp, no tears. Just the steady realization that this wasn't a moment of weakness or desperation on their part. It was a design, something thought through, rehearsed, and timed around my habits and my trust. The pain was still there, heavy and real, but it moved to the background as something else took its place. Awareness. I understood then that reacting would only serve them, that anger, confrontation. Even grief would tip my hand before I knew the full shape of what I was facing. So I closed the wallet and put everything back exactly as it had been. I didn't let on that anything had changed. From the outside, I was the same person I had been that morning. Inside, I had stepped into a different role entirely. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was watching. I didn't confront them. I didn't run. I didn't even let myself imagine what either option would cost. I chose the third path, the one that required the most discipline. I stayed exactly where I was and became invisible in the most ordinary way possible. Life continued on the surface. I made breakfast, I answered messages, I asked about Daniel's day and listened the way I always had. I smiled when Rachel stopped by and nodded at the right moments. Careful not to overdo it, careful not to pull away. Normalcy became my cover, and I wore it well because I had been practicing it for years without knowing. Inside, everything was different. I paid attention to pauses, to patterns, to the way information slipped when people believed they were safe. I noticed what was repeated and what was avoided. I let silence stretch instead of filling it. I learned quickly that people reveal more when they think they are being trusted than when they are being questioned. There were moments when the weight of it all pressed hard against my ribs. Moments when I wanted to scream the truth just to feel real again. But I understood something crucial then. As long as they believed I knew nothing, I had something they didn't. Time. Time allowed me to listen without suspicion being triggered. Time let details stack up into something solid. Time turned ignorance, at least theirs, into my strongest protection. Every day that passed without confrontation made them bolder, less careful, more convinced that their version of events would hold. I stopped thinking of myself as someone waiting for answers. I was gathering them, quietly, methodically, with intention. Patience wasn't weakness anymore. It was leverage. Every calm response, every ordinary gesture, every moment I chose restraint over reaction was a step forward. I wasn't surviving the aftermath of betrayal. I was shaping what came next, preparing for the moment when I would no longer just be watching, but moving first. I knew I couldn't keep watching forever. Observation had given me clarity, but clarity alone doesn't change outcomes. At some point, I needed to touch the surface of what they were hiding, just enough to see how it rippled back. So I chose a moment that looked harmless, a quiet evening, familiar routines, nothing that would raise alarms. I let myself appear tired, slightly vulnerable, the way I had always been when I trusted people to catch me if I leaned. I spoke casually about stress, about paperwork, about how fragile life can feel when plans go wrong. I didn't accuse. I didn't hint too sharply. I simply let certain ideas exist in the room. Then I watched. Daniel's ease faltered in places it never had before. Small pauses stretched too long. His attention flickered, not toward concern, but calculation. Rachel mirrored him without realizing it, her expressions tightening for a breath before smoothing back into something friendly. They weren't reacting to my words. They were reacting to what they thought I might know. That was all I needed. The power shift didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, settling into me as certainty. I wasn't guessing anymore. Guilt has a gravity of its own, And once you learn how to feel it pull, it's unmistakable. Every careful response, every over-explained reassurance, confirmed that the truth I held was real and dangerous to them. I stayed calm. I let them believe their performance was working. Inside, something steadied, anger sharpened into focus, fear thinned into resolve. I understood then that confrontation would only scatter them. What I needed was containment. As the night ended and routines resumed, I felt the balance tip fully in my favor. They thought they were managing risk. They didn't see that I was already designing an ending, one that wouldn't rely on pressure or panic, but on inevitability. The next move wouldn't be subtle, it would be final. By the time I set the final piece in motion, nothing felt rushed. The plan had already been unfolding for days, quietly aligning itself around their expectations. All I had to do was give them what they believed they wanted. I framed it as relief, a way forward. I let them think I was ready to smooth things over, ready to move assets, ready to sign papers that would finally untangle the tension they pretended not to feel. I chose a setting that felt familiar and private, a place where they assumed control would tilt naturally back into their hands. They arrived confident, almost eager, mistaking my calm for surrender. What they couldn't see was how much preparation had already happened beyond that room. As the minutes passed, I watched certainty drain from their faces, small delays, unexpected questions, procedures that didn't bend the way they expected. The air shifted, thickening with unease. They began to realize that the version of events they had rehearsed wasn't matching reality. That was when the safeguards revealed themselves. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough clarity to make escape impossible. Documentation surfaced that mirrored what I had already seen, records that connected timelines, intentions, and signatures they couldn't explain away. The room seemed to shrink as control slipped from them and settled somewhere solid and immovable. I didn't feel triumph. I felt stillness. There was a moment when everything they had built on secrecy collapsed under the weight of facts. No shouting, no pleading that mattered, just the quiet understanding that consequences had arrived, precise and unavoidable, as it ended. I felt the tension release from my shoulders for the first time since that night at the airport. Justice didn't feel loud or satisfying in the way stories promise. It felt heavy, sobering, and necessary. And as I walked away from the final confirmation that it was over, I knew the hardest part wasn't what I had done to survive. It was accepting what survival had cost me and what healing would still demand next. When it was over, the world didn't snap back into place. It settled slowly, like dust after a collapse. There were legal outcomes and formal endings, the necessary confirmations that what had been planned against me no longer had power. I didn't linger on those details. They mattered, but they weren't where the healing lived. What stayed with me was the quiet that followed, the absence of constant vigilance, the strange grief of losing people who were still alive, just no longer part of my life. I mourned the version of myself who trusted without pause, who believed love was always safe. Letting her go hurt more than I expected. Healing came in small, almost invisible steps, rearranging my home, reclaiming mornings that belonged only to me, making decisions without explaining them. I learned that strength isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's choosing rest. Sometimes it's choosing distance. Sometimes it's choosing yourself even when it feels unfamiliar. I understand now that survival isn't just about getting through danger. It's about deciding who you become afterward. I didn't harden. I didn't close myself off. I learned discernment. I learned that intuition deserves respect and that kindness doesn't require blindness. If you're listening to this and carrying a story that taught you the cost of trust, I want you to know something. You're not weak for believing in people. You're brave for surviving what belief made possible. Thank you for staying with me through this, for listening, for holding space for a truth that wasn't easy to tell. If any part of this reflected something in your own life, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to rebuild yourself after betrayal? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone.